know, when the pessimists overwhelm the happy folks around you, you've got to be talking about Japan. The quarterly Tankan Business Sentiment Survey is deep in dry rot, yet the numbers actually impress. Dubai faces a day of reckoning as over $5 billion in debt could go belly up if the money is nowhere to be found. And he carries 4 stars, I believe 5 stars, as a top former military man for the USA, but he says a big hug, not a big guns, is the better way to go. Okay, it is a Manic Monday here on Asia Confidential. I'm Bernie in Hong Kong. Our guest today, a good friend of mine who wears many hats, Lawrence Brahm, author of the Anti-Globalization Breakfast Club, also entrepreneur, political columnist, activist, and economist. Does a lot of jobs wrapped up into one. Here's his book right here, by the way. It's really, really colorful. I still haven't finished it. He uses a lot of big words. I'm just kidding, Lawrence. Later on in the show, investing in London property. Really? After scooting and skidding for a long time, only recently did it start to bounce back. Our friend Tim Murphy from IP Global with a regular update on global property trends. And if you want to engage us, and please do, we are at AsiaConf@Bloomberg.net. There is our handle at the bottom of your screen. Stimulus is helping pessimism or ease pessimism among the factories in Japan, but they're still planning to rein in the spending because a rising yen and falling prices are cutting into profits. Mike Byrne has details of the quarterly Tankan, and it was only negative by not 1, not 2, but 24 steps, Mike. Let's hear a big hip hip hooray all around.
Well, it was an improvement, Bernie. Large manufacturer sentiment rising 9 points from the third quarter, which was 3 points more than economists had forecast. However, at minus 27, the pessimists do still outweigh the optimists. The index has not been positive since the second quarter of last year.
The pace of improvement was slower than in the September survey. So this still leaves some concerns about the possible slowdown of the economic expansion, but the direction is okay, so this means that the market consensus expectations of no change in the BOJ policy on Friday should be maintained.
Even though the pessimism is easing, manufacturers plan to cut spending by 13.8% this business year. That's 3 percentage points more than they forecast in the last survey. Prospect Asset Management Chairman Curtis Fries, though, says he's not concerned that much about the cut in capex.
The second section of Tokyo is trading at about an average of 0.6 times book. So there's an ability to acquire capacity without spending new money and expand very cheaply.
Investors not sharing his optimism today, selling shares of Japan's biggest manufacturers, Toyota and Nissan, down now 1.3% apiece. Well, one of the main reasons for that is that the yen has been strengthening quite sharply against the dollar and the euro, currently trading at 88.55 to the dollar and 129.59 to the euro. We're also seeing some weakness in consumer electronics stocks with Sony down more than 0.5%, as is Panasonic. Bernie, back to you.
And that yen making it impossible to go skiing in Niseko near Sapporo this winter. There's always next year. Thanks, Mike. Mike Byrne on the Tankan beat. By the way, the yen is a little bit north against the dollar, exactly opposite what they want after a couple of days of losses. People looking for safe haven. Today is D-Day on Dubai. I'm going to have more on that in the next section of the program. Others say it's time to buy the Chinese yuan, which has been pegged to the dollar in a very narrow range and essentially fixed against the greenback since last year.
You had the export number on Friday not breaking into positive territory that a lot of people thought it would. So it's actually picked up a little bit and providing a little bit more incentive to go into it. But we are pretty confident about this trade. We think that as you get into the early few months of 2010, you're going to see positive export growth, and that's going to put greater pressure on Beijing to make a move on the currency.
Stock markets around Asia mostly lower, led by commodities after a drop in resources prices. There you go, a loss leader on that screen there. Here in Hong Kong, with the market down 1 1/3. Lawrence Brahm, my good friend, he is here on AC with us today. Hello, sir.
How are you this morning?
Lots going on in the world. And
That's
here
right.
we are. Luckily, we're in December, and we have the luxury of sort of looking back and then thinking forward. Where are we in this point in time?
Well, we have to look forward because right now you have this Copenhagen summit. And it looks like there's no deal. I mean, right now the parties are trying to thrash out a deal at the last minute, but there's quite a great difference between them. And the question is whether the Kyoto Protocol, which had provided certain mechanisms, is going to be continued, or whether they are going to actually be able to restructure a new approach to climate change. In the end, if they can't do that, well, maybe different countries and different regions will go their own way. And that doesn't necessarily mean a good thing.
You know, when I see all the arguments, and I probably see more of the arguments on either side than most people by virtue of what I do, as sort of a mediation or arbitration point in the middle, I hate to say this, and I don't mean to be a killjoy or anything, but it sounds like I was covering the predecessor to the World Trade Organization before it was known as the WTO. This was 15, 20 years ago. The general agreement to talk and talk gave way to the World Talking Organization. I don't think the world can wait 10, 15, 20 years for some agreement on a successor to Kyoto.
Well, there are scientists who are now estimating that if we don't do something about climate change very quickly, that really by the year 2035, 70% of the Himalayan glaciers will be gone. Now, if that happens, half of humanity has no water to drink, because the major river systems in China, the Yellow Yangtze River, the Brahmaputra, Ganges, Indus in South Asia, and even Southeast Asia, the Irrawaddy, the Mekong, the Salween River, all have their source from the Himalayan glaciers. And with CO2 emissions at current trajectories, if the glaciers reach tip point, and again, we're looking 20 years out for major catastrophe and a lot of catastrophe beforehand, half of humanity has no water to drink. We can give our children money, but can we give them water?
Giving them money, exactly what they don't need when you don't even have the basic tenets of life. Unfortunately, this whole climate thing, the activists, the people who really want to make a difference, did in some ways end up torpedoing themselves, because on the other hand, on the other side of the equation, the AR4, the whole East Anglia issue kind of snowballed into ammunition for the naysayers. And do you think that maybe there was a lot of irresponsibility going into this meeting?
Well, I think the irresponsibility begins with governments, and the massive protests that we've seen, almost 10,000 people on the street, 1,000 arrested, is because of the dysfunctional governments. Governments are not addressing the issue, are not taking responsibility. And even CO2 trading, carbon trading mechanisms are simply pushing the problem on the South, really a kind of derivative to allow the developed industrial countries to continue their CO2 emissions. We are heading toward catastrophe.
I hope that's not the ultimate outcome. There are people out there who say it's too late, no matter what they do, to do anything. We'll return in 2 minutes. Still to come on AC, a day of reckoning in the next chapter of the Dubai mess. Billions in debt comes due today. The clock ticks down. We'll have it right here.
Capital Fund, not a billionaire, are you?
No. Euro both falling on a report. UK's rating is at risk.
Joined by a very special guest today, Prime Minister.
Of 1%. Honda's American depository receipts rising to high.
We have lots and lots from Hong Kong and the PRC throughout
Stocks, but it's been a pretty tricky morning because Asian stocks.
You now can watch Charlie Rose around the globe, weeknights on Bloomberg Television.
Making some of the headlines at this hour, Citigroup may repay its $20 billion in TARP bailout funds to the U.S. government. Insiders say the bank is near an agreement with the U.S. Treasury Department. It wants to avoid being the only large bank left needing government aid. Separately, a new higher takeover bid for AXA Asia Pacific, the insurance company AMP of Australia, and French insurer AXA, the parent of AXA Asia Pac, raised their bid to almost $12 billion, 16% higher than the original bid. AXA AP rejected the initial approach, saying it was too cheap. And in Australia, Woodside Petroleum will raise about $2.25 billion in a share sale to help fund liquefied natural gas projects along the west. Woodside among many companies trying to capitalize on demand for cleaner burning fuels. Dicey situation, their own D-Day in Dubai today. The company, of course, that built the whole thing from a pile of sand. Nikhil's biggest bond obligation matures today. What's going to happen? The clock is ticking, and Jason's on top of the story. Jay.
Thank you, Bernie. Well, we're talking about an Islamic bond maturing at $3.5 billion. Nikhil, a property unit of Dubai World, is expected to not be able to pay and instead negotiate. The Islamic bond is the biggest part of a $5.25 billion in debt that's coming due. Dubai World began talks with banks this month to restructure $26 billion. This is the biggest maturity of any Dubai entity since the world found out that their bonds were in trouble. The Dubai government said back in November that its state-run holdings are seeking a standstill accord on their debts. And it will say no payment by Nikhil could indicate that Dubai wishes to reschedule all three bonds. Now, Nikhil accumulated debt during a 6-year real estate boom in Dubai when the Sheikhdom borrowed $10 billion and its controlled companies $70 billion. If it defaults today, Nikhil has 2 weeks to remedy the situation and prevent bondholders from taking legal action. Bernie.
And what is the timeline on this? The 3.5 actually snowballs to the 5+ with additional instruments, but presumably on top of the 5+, there's more and more as the calendar rolls along. That's the thing about time. There's nothing you can do to stop it progressing along.
Absolutely right, and there could be a domino effect that we see if they are to default today. So there are a lot of people who are watching and watching very closely to see what happens, how they will respond to this deadline.
That was an awful lot of building, Lawrence, in one place in a very, very compressed short time horizon, and boom, this is what we have. I don't know if you think spend a lot of time thinking about Dubai, but it certainly crept up on us. A lot of people could see the bubble forming and, would have warned about it if it was a talking point last year.
Well, Dubai is an amazing case of, tremendous spending, government spending, fiscal spending on infrastructure investment, and of course the best and the brightest of bankers, lawyers, all descended upon Dubai, Russian mafia. It was just a boomtown mentality driven by effectively massive stimulus packaged by the government based on teetering debt. And, we have this repeated cycle, and we don't have sustainable systems. It's an example of what's happened before. It's an example of what's going to happen again. Right now, the question is even China. You have massive, massive spending on infrastructure, on cement, on more buildings, on more of these types of roads and highways. The question is, if you don't have the substance of the economy to be able to keep up, if you don't have production, if you don't have consumption, then these things will, of course, result in bubbles that burst. And this was what happened with Dubai, and it has global repercussions, particularly very serious repercussions for all countries. Iran, which was doing tremendous amount of its business through Dubai. Iran's probably the first nation to suffer the most from this this bubble burst.
You hear about the big megalopolises vying against each other to be the supreme financial center of the world. Whether it's London or New York, there's always this Hong Kong versus Singapore versus Shanghai, Dubai for the Middle East. What does Qatar want to be, for instance, right? Doha, what do they want to be? How many global financial centers do we really need in this digital age where everything is kind of done on this rather than open outcry, where you don't need a lot of physical infrastructure, so to speak?
The structure of our global economic system is in the process of changing. And so these centers will not be able to sustain themselves simply as global centers with so much supply coming on board. What they will be is regional centers, and they'll remain regional centers. And to be a regional financial center, it depends not on how many buildings you have. It depends on your legal system, your legal apparatus, and your banking regulation regulatory system. And these are critical, even with the growth of Shanghai and Beijing and all the financial street investments in Pudong and buildings rising up. Hong Kong is still the key financial center because of the regulatory system here, banking system, the transparency of that system, and the reliance of the legal system. If you don't have that, all the infrastructure investment, all the high-rise buildings in the world doesn't make you a qualified financial center.
The whole industry is really under the gun right now. I mean, you've seen the news flow. You know, it is not fashionable to be a highly paid banker right now. Over the weekend, President Obama actually said, I did not run for office, I did not run for president to help a bunch of fat cat bankers line their pockets. I'm paraphrasing a little bit. Is there a risk of overreaction in the other direction? I mean, you know, if you're a hardworking nurse, a firefighter, a police officer, a kindergarten teacher, you look at these numbers and your jaw drops, but there's nothing you could do about it. But is there a risk of too much public backlash against an industry which, you know, as a species, we allowed to grow and prosper?
I don't think there's enough, actually, to tell you the truth. I mean, we had this massive stimulus package that bailed out Wall Street, and then suddenly on Wall Street they give out enormous bonuses to CEOs and to the chief executives. I mean, this is really not managing the system well. And what you have is you've had a creation of amount of enormous wealth at the top. We've talked about globalization, shared prosperity, but throughout the past 2 decades of globalization, you've got over 40% of the world's population living in poverty, 1/6 at extreme poverty. At the same time, you have all this concentration of wealth in Wall Street. Is it deserved? Of course, it's going to create ramifications. And you have demands in the street. You've got demands from people to have effectively a more responsible system. You know, you're taking all kinds of financial instruments, ultimately selling them to the man on the street who doesn't know what he's buying. And what he's buying fluff, he's buying air. He's buying effectively bad debt. We're creating pyramid schemes. That is why our financial system's collapsing, and it's the headache of President Obama to now try and get us out of this mess.
It's an irony that so many decades after Charles Ponzi, he still persists in so many forums. I mean, it's almost like, you know, people need to know on a need-to-know basis, and that's it. We'll just keep this discussion going. Still to come, though, a former Top Gun of America preaches love and friendship, not standoff, as the way forward for the PRC as it relates to the U.S. of A.
This update of today's leading actively traded stocks, brought to you by iShares, the world leader in exchange-traded funds. This update of today's leading actively traded stocks, brought to you by iShares, the world leader in exchange-traded funds.
A private island paradise in Phuket. In life, our choices define us. Some choose a life of adventure. Some choose a life of quiet pleasures and well-being. A life of privacy, security, elegance and comfort, enveloped in natural splendor. For your private island residence, go to phillips-property.com/private island today.
An exclusive conversation with America's most trusted...
You want to be greedy when others are fearful, and you want to be fearful...
That's the way I win Grand Slams. I think everyone...
An amazing collection of interviews.
You now can watch Charlie Rose around the globe, weeknights on Bloomberg Television.
know, for political expedience and political gain, China is often blamed for job losses in America. But a consummate American, retired U.S. Army General Wesley Clark, the former Supreme NATO Commander for Europe, who's now the chairman of U.S. iBank Rodman & Renshaw, says the PRC can help the USA create tens of thousands of new jobs. And the former U.S. presidential candidate told Steve that China should be viewed as a partner, not an adversary.
I see China as, right now, as the global job creation engine.
For China or for the world?
For the world. If it was the United States after World War II, when we had 50% of the economic capacity of the world and we were exporting all over, certainly then the United States was the engine. Germany and Japan recovered finally in the 1990s with the WTO and globalization and the communications revolution. We've sparked economic development elsewhere, but China is coming on like gangbusters. And their technology, their determination, their outreach, their internal market, their capital formation, all of these are really important for the rest of the world. In scale, of course, they're not where the United States is right now. But in terms of the dynamism of the economy, it's very, very important.
Are they playing fairly with the value of the renminbi?
Well, I think you have to
protectionism?
You have to look at every aspect of the sector of the economy differently. So, yes, I mean, each nation has to guard its own prerogatives and watch out for the others, and we have the right mechanism under WTO to help us challenge and respond on these particular sectors. I think you're going to see the renminbi revalued step by step, gradually, in accordance with the long-term plan. And I'm as eager as any of my American friends to see the revaluation of the renminbi. In certain industries like textiles, it's critical. But on the other hand, I recall in the 1980s when the yen was revalued quickly at the behest of the United States, and suddenly people gasped because 9 of the top 10 banks in the world were Japanese, and there was a wave of concern about Japan taking over the world. So you got to be careful what you wish for. You may not like it when you get it. I think the gradual step that China's undertaken, step by step, seems to be working. They pulled out of the setback that the global economies had quickly. They're pulling the rest of us with them, and I'm applauding China's economic development.
In 2007, you said China's economic development could imperil our own economic security by drawing off American jobs. Do you feel that way? Is this
Well, I think that we have to be just as dynamic in the United States as China is. So we've got to look at our own pricing signals. We've got to look at what we're doing in our marketplace. You know, in the American economy, we're very good at producing high-technology defense goods. I'd like to see us be just as good in producing high-technology energy products.
China's rise economically has been nothing short of a miracle, but its military is also building up at a steady pace. If you saw on TV, or as I was there at the military parade, they paraded out their new intercontinental ballistic missiles. They wanted to send a message, I believe, to China, but also to the rest of the world. Do you feel China is going to be, or the balance of power in the Pacific militarily is slowly switching to China?
Well, I think the most important power that a nation can have is its economic strength, not its military. And I'd like to encourage China and the United States to keep in mind that the fundamental strength that our nations have to have is economic and financial. So every bit of resources that we put into weaponry takes away from that. Weaponry's great, it's beautiful. I'm an old military guy. There's nothing I like better than a fighter plane or a great Navy ship to look at, or wonderful soldiers. But you have to recognize that all that intensity, all that ingenuity, all that technology could be put into things that could more directly help other people.
Mind you, this was the former Supreme Commander Europe for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Lawrence, I think he's getting a little sentimental in his middle age or something like that when he advocates don't spend any more on these big guns. Love all around. You were shocked by that, weren't you, from an old Army guy?
Actually, though, he's kind of seen the light. If we actually take our spending and we stop spending it on high technology for military use, we start spending it on technology for the environment and to reform our healthcare system, then we may not be in the problems we are right now. To a great extent, it's the overextension of America's military reach and the over-reliance on outsourcing wars, producing weapons for other countries, that actually has weakened in many ways our economy. I think his comment was right on point, that you don't judge a country's influence necessarily by its military power, by its economic power, and to a great extent by driving, our own military expansion over the past, particularly during the Bush administration. This has, of course, weakened our economic strength, it's weakened our financial strength, and it has put America in the situation it is today.
Well, to be fair, one can lob missiles at the Bush administration, but it's also the current commander-in-chief who's just done his own surge, and now it's his war in Afghanistan at the same time. Ironically, weeks after the fact, went and picked up his Nobel Peace Prize in Oslo, Norway, as well. The fact is, the world will never break out in global peace. It's just not going to. You're always going to have people, you're always going to have rogue elements in this world that you have to deal with head on, or one way or the other. North Korea, Afghanistan, Iran. At all. The
truth of the matter is the surge in troops in Afghanistan is only going to create a continued cycle of despair, because this is not, American troops' foreign presence in Afghanistan is galvanizing support for the Taliban. To a great extent, people are angry that they have an outside presence occupying their country, and are very angry with an administration, their Karzai's administration, which is seen as corrupt. Unfortunately, what's happened is now we're in a situation of a region that the increase in troops may temporarily create some control over the Taliban, but in turn it will, many aid workers on the ground, say this will actually create continued deterioration and instability.
Withdraw and hope for the best?
To a great extent, that's what's going to have to happen sooner or later. So it's just a question of time. It's a question of whether that's done early or it's done later. And if it's done later, with continued disintegration of the situation, spreading into Pakistan, spreading into Xinjiang area of China, we could have a global, we could have a whole deterioration along the Himalayan chain.
Okay, we're going to go back to the other issue, and that's climate in a little bit. The clock ticks down to Friday, the close of Copenhagen, and why our guest says those talks may be too short-sighted.
We are living in a global village, a village in which resources are finite and less as we talk. And therefore we need to adopt some village values, values of compassion, caring not only for ourselves but also for others.
Let Standard Chartered's Forex expertise power your ambition. Let Standard Chartered's Forex expertise power your ambition.
You saw the scenes early this morning and they were jarring. Where was the security detail for the Italian head of state? Fran has the latest on that front. How is Mr. Berlusconi doing? Fran?
Well, he's in the hospital, and you know what, Bernie, I can't get enough of these scenes. Let's play this video here when he was struck in the face after a rally in Milan, leaving him with a broken nose and fractured teeth. Yeah, it's bad. Berlusconi will be spending 24 hours in the hospital, and he says, you know, he's fine. Well, the man accused of the attack was arrested at the scene, and Berlusconi's been mired in sex scandals, and so is Tiger Woods. And that's why Accenture says it's terminating a 6-year relationship with the #1 golfer. And they've pulled a picture of Tiger Woods from their website, saying that this man is no longer the right representative for their company. Procter & Gamble said it will begin phasing him out of the Gillette promotions, and AT&T is also evaluating their options, but Nike and Electronic Arts says no, they're still standing by Tiger. In Chile, early results show that billionaire Sebastian Pinera is the lead in the first round of presidential elections, but a second round will be needed, though some say that he's set to be Chile's first conservative leader in decades. And Copenhagen's climate negotiations are mangled over how to aid poorer countries and how to enforce nations to meet emissions targets. Countries are relying on President Barack Obama to push these talks forward when he gets there in Copenhagen on Friday. Bernie, back to you.
And I guess he'll just be there for the one day then, essentially, right?
Exactly.
Okay, and I guess he can solve all the problems in the world in one day since he's a Nobel Prize winner. He can do anything, this president, can't he, Lawrence?
Well, I think there's tremendous hope of what he can do, but to be very frank, he is also shackled by our own domestic politics. And a great onus is on the United States to take the initiative on climate change. You have different positions of U.S., of China, of the developing world, and to a great extent these gaps are not going to be closed unless the major CO2 emitters, China, America, and India, together sit down and work out a system to actually reduce CO2 emissions. And all the trading of carbon, all these type of mechanisms are not actually reducing emissions. They're simply taking the responsibility and transferring it on the global south, giving it to the developed countries. Aid by itself, spending money, is not also going to solve this problem. You have funds of $173 million for developing countries to deal with climate change. This is nothing. They need $170 billion to be able to address this issue. You're going to have global catastrophe if we don't avert it. So really what it's going to require is Barack Obama to sit down with Wen Jiabao and to be able to have the two countries together with India begin some process of dialogue to reduce the CO2 emissions. The commitments that have been given so far by Obama are, it's great, finally America's taking a stand on this and making a commitment to reduce 17%, but in reality over 1990 emissions is only a 4% reduction. And this is simply not enough. And it doesn't give Obama the moral high ground to drive forward the other countries.
You know why this is a waste of time, Lawrence? Is because they're talking not in terms of years, they're talking in terms of decades. They're not even talking about CO2 reductions in many cases here. They're talking about reduction in carbon intensity of output.
This is just a game.
I don't have any kids, and I'm not going to have any kids in this world. I don't want to have kids to have to face the world in the year 2070 or 2080 or 2090, because I think it's going to be really, really nothing that what we can imagine in our minds.
Shifting the debate to intensity, carbon intensity, is just a numbers game.
Who shifted the debate anyway?
It's just a numbers game, and this is basically an industrialized countries playing with it. China says, oh, we're going to shift it to intensity. This is based on a % of your GDP output. So it's actually only playing with numbers. It's not addressing straightforward the carbon output issue. We have the technology, we have the ability to be able to reduce CO2, to be able to move toward green energy. But that's going to require two things. It's going to require corporations to join on the bandwagon, and it's going to require governments to have the policies that will incentivize the corporations to do that. And right now the corporate lobbying system in governments, both in America and in China, is not in that direction. It's not supporting green technology. It's actually supporting a prolongation of the current situation. And it's also political. In America, you know, the reality is that the leadership has to tell people our lifestyle, the way we live, is no longer sustainable in a planet of shrinking global resources. At the same time, for China, its whole program of social stability is built upon massive infrastructure spending, stimulus packages to create jobs almost artificially, which are both consuming resources at trajectories that the rest of the planet cannot sustain.
You've got too many disparate interests on different timelines at different stages of their national development. Anyway, a couple minutes left in this section. Can we take a few emails here?
Sure, go ahead.
This is very, very rat-a-tat, very smorgasbord, okay, in no particular order. Justin writes in, if government spending ceases in the next couple of years, where does the private sector in the U.S. seek to remain competitive internationally? What do you actually export? What is America good for other than burger flipping? What do you sell? The U.S. dollar? Tongue-in-cheek.
Well, that's what we're selling right now. The problem is we have so much stimulus package which is going into creating consumption that we're not addressing the core problem. The core problem is not that we need more consumption. The problem is we have too much consumption, which is actually creating the dilemma that they're talking about in Copenhagen. We do need to get back to manufacturing. We need to get back to green manufacturing. We have some of the brightest minds in America, but we are not giving them the opportunity to develop new technology, new industries. And we need to be reinvesting into education. We need to be reinvesting into environment. We need to be reinvesting into our own industries back home. And to just stimulate consumption is not going to solve the problem. It's only prolonging it. It's a Band-Aid.
You could forgive the average person for being confused by their governments when they're being told you were too profligate and you overspent, you live beyond your means, and now you've lost your house. But we'd like you to get back into the stores and keep shopping because it's good for your neighbor, good for your town, and it's good for your country. I mean, that is, we're ruled by schizophrenics in this world. That's our problem.
You know what it is? It's a temporary Band-Aiding a situation which is cancerous. It's not actually addressing the issue at the root. And we really need to face the fact that we need a new economic paradigm, new economic system. We need to have new values. Our values cannot be based on consumption alone. You can't measure a person's wealth as the measurement of their value in society, the number of Mercedes-Benz they have in their garage, or the number of brands they wear to create their identity. It is because of our skewed values that we're creating a financial system which is not sustainable, and government is becoming dysfunctional, unable to address it.
Yeah, it is not a numbers game. That's a good point there. Lawrence, it's not the he or she who ends up with the most toys wins. All right, we're going to be back in just a second with lots more Asia Confidential. I'm going to give you today's history lesson and thoughts forward to 2010.
When a Singapore fund wanted to expand distribution, it turned to BNY Mellon. Our team brought together expertise from Tokyo to Luxembourg to Boston, providing custody and administration and asset management, introducing the fund to investors in Japan. People working together have made us a leader with solutions tailored to your challenges, delivered wherever you do business. Who's helping you?
Bloomberg Television, the source.
As a Forex trader, I chose Interactive Brokers for my business. Unlike other Forex brokers, they don't mark up quotes. I trade with the highest bid and the lowest offer that IB selects from 10 of the world's largest Forex dealers. With group equity of $4 billion, Interactive Brokers is a safe haven for my money. Interactive Brokers. Forex, stocks, options, futures, bonds. Worldwide from one account.
You now can watch Charlie Rose around the globe, weeknights on Bloomberg Television.
Wait, wherever you are.
this day in 1994, in your history lesson du jour, China began construction of the Three Gorges Dam on the Yangtze River. The dam flooded archaeological sites, displaced more than 1 million people. But on the other hand, it purported to replace coal consumption and allow for more shipping and thereby cut greenhouse gas production, if you buy that whole story. In 2003, 9 months after invading Iraq, President George Bush announced U.S. troops captured Saddam Hussein. Military says the former dictator was found hiding in a so-called spider hole, or deep underground chamber. He's later tried by the Iraqis and subsequently executed years later. 5 years later on this day, W narrowly misses being hit with a shoe. That's the right one. That's the left one. Good reflexes. W, in his final visit to Iraq, the journalist who threw the shoe had been arrested twice by U.S. forces. There's your instant replay here. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison, but only served 9 months, was released earlier this year. Shoe throwing is a severe sign of disrespect in the Iraq culture. Our guest today, Lawrence Brahm, is a very good friend of mine, a key driver behind the Himalayan Consensus, an alternative global framework to what is now known as the Washington Consensus. If you've been watching a few programs that Lawrence and I have been doing, you know that we don't agree on all the fine print, but it makes for healthy conversation. When you're talking and debating, that can be healthy if you're listening to the other side. In the wake of the global financial crisis, have things changed much? Have they changed enough for a new world order to occur, so to speak? Lawrence, what we're going to, as time, you know what, the calendar and the clock is unrelenting. It doesn't matter where you are, what you're feeling, how old you are, anything. It is agnostic to everything that goes around. Here we are. We've got a fresh new year coming around the horizon. Describe the kind of landscape that we'll be heading into.
The global tectonic plates have shifted. Our economics are in the process of changing. Values are also changing as well. We see this with Copenhagen. We see this with the massive protests that are coming out calling for leaders in government to do something about climate change. And we see the rise of regionalism. We see the rise of organizations like BRIC, that are bringing together Brazil, India, Russia, China together into new amalgamations. We're seeing a return to localization. And we're even seeing this within the U.S. We're seeing a retrenchment from the idea of promoting a kind of a global one standard across the world and seeking local standards, local approaches, indigenous approaches to be able to have a sustainable future. And I think this is what we're going to see in 2010.
This sounds like a complete extrication or withdrawal from the trends which have been in play for much of this generation. This is like the hunter-gatherer, your community kind of approach. Like we don't want to trade with halfway around the world because it doesn't pay to burn that much carbon to do that trade, so think community. It sounds almost like Walden. You'll forgive me for saying that, right? Well,
in some ways it is. We are leaving a decade of excessiveness. We're leaving a decade of excessiveness on Wall Street driven by a neoliberal economic approach that says that everything is driven by greed. Greed alone will balance, equalize markets. And, we have to have complete information to have markets equalized. But of course, information doesn't exist, particularly in developing countries. And as the gaps get wider, people are thinking twice. Is our life measured by materialism? Is it measured by how many brands we have? Do these global brands define our identity, or is there something more? And that emotional perception is driven by an economic reality. The system of consumption, of growth, of neoliberal economics, which drove the past decade, collapsed a year ago. It collapsed in September 2008. And with that, in the wake of that, we see a rise of regionalism, we see a rise of local solutions, and we see a lot less political rhetoric across the board. Countries are seeking their own solutions. You see South America now be very much driven by Brazil. Asia is being very much driven by China and India. And in turn, much of Europe and America are undergoing a rethink of values, and are turning more and more green. And this we see by the protesters who are on the street in Copenhagen, who are angry at the inability of government to be able to provide for the future, to be able to provide a single resource for our future, not oil, but water.
The protesters and the mindset which you highlight here are still in the distinct minority. Are they not? This does not represent the overwhelming majority of people in this global
But now it is an increasing voice, and the voice can be heard louder than before. And to a great extent, this sort of populist voice began, of course, in 1998 in Seattle with WTO protests, and has continued with what has been called the anti-globalization movement. That this movement is not against globalization per se. They are against the globalization of one standard, of one values, which encroaches upon people's lifestyle, life quality. And in turn, this organized, or actually very disorganized set of organized movements is coming together on the climate change issue. It is now having one voice on one issue, and that is real climate change. Address this issue before we don't have a planet to live on. Don't continue to create derivatives and all kinds of different mechanisms to allow the industrialized nations to continue their CO2 emissions while transferring the problem to the South. And in this case, you see a new set of values. People are more concerned about their environment. You know, what is the use of having all kinds of, toys and lots of money and lots of wealth and lots of houses if when you step out of your house, if you step out of your Mercedes, you're breathing polluted air? What use is it to have lots of money and worry about your global markets if you don't have clean water to give your children to drink? And this is no longer sort of a kind of a beatnik hippies crying. This is actually a real phenomenon. Scientists are looking at. They're saying that our future ahead of us is very, very, very bleak. And so what's going to happen is values will change. Those values will drive corporations. Corporations are going to have to think about their products not necessarily being for consumption of brands. They're not going to necessarily think about their P&L and their shareholders' value. They've got to think about whether they're providing stakeholders' values. People will vote with their money. They're going to buy products. They're going to buy services which contribute to the society, to the environmental protection, to the sustainability of long-term economics.
Doesn't matter how much money you have. There are some things you can't buy your way out of in this world. And I guess that's just one example. You can get out of a Ferrari, you can live in a 50 million square foot home, but the air you share with everybody. Lawrence, thank you for being a friend all year, okay? Have a happy new year, okay? Lawrence Brahm on the future, 2010 and beyond. Still to come, Britain's biggest property website says the housing market recovery is going to peter out next year. Why does our next guest still think that London real estate's where you want to be at? Tim Murphy, IP Global, is going to join us on the program with a look at the jolly UK right ahead.
Standard Chartered's Forex expertise power your ambition. Standard Chartered's Forex expertise power your ambition.
Bloomberg Television, the source.